Good evening. According to the American filmmaker Oliver Stone, John F. Kennedy's assassination, far from being the work of a lone gunman, was in reality a coup d'etat, planned by the CIA and the military, executed with a little help from Cuban exiles and the mafia, and covered up by the FBI. In tonight's Late Show, we'll be discussing the credibility of those extraordinary claims with, among others, Kennedy's former press secretary, Pierre Salinger. And we'll be examining how those 3 shots, or were there more, fired in Dallas, Texas in 1963, blew a hole in the American psyche and let in the demons of conspiracy and paranoia.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. There has been a shooting. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. The president's car is now going past me, now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service
President of the United States is dead. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
John Kennedy was assassinated on November the 22nd, 1963, on a visit to Dallas, Texas. Within hours, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for murdering the president. 2 days later, Oswald was shot by another apparently lone gunman.
Oswald has been shot.
The suspect's name is Jack Rubenstein, I believe. He goes by the name of Jack Ruby.
Ruby's actions meant that Kennedy's murder would never come to trial. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren to head a top-level investigation into Kennedy's death. The Warren Commission was to become the official version of the Kennedy assassination. The Warren report concluded that Oswald was the single gunman and that there was no evidence for any conspiracy. But suspicion of a conspiracy continued. There were allegations of a cover-up. Critics pointed to problems with the Warren report, contradictions, gaps, even the suppression of evidence. In particular, new medical and ballistics research challenged the idea of a single gunman. One of the first to express serious misgivings was the New Orleans DA, Jim Garrison.
I believe that the assassination of President Kennedy was a clever operation involving a number of men. In fact, we know it. And as a result, I think that the men on the Warren Commission were fooled in a sense. Oswald was not a communist. Oswald was not pro-Castro. And as a result of the operation, which was working here in the summer of 1963, a spin-off occurred, an unexpected change of direction occurred, which in the fall of 1963 resulted in that lethal apparatus being turned against President Kennedy. And that's what happened, and that's the first time I've ever said it publicly.
In 1966, Garrison launched an investigation into the Kennedy assassination, but the case he brought against an alleged associate of Oswald's ended in failure in 1969. In the 1970s, Watergate and revelations of covert action by the CIA made people more receptive to conspiracy theories. American culture became increasingly obsessed with hidden government and political violence. The early 70s saw a series of films suggesting conspiracies at the very heart of national government. In 1976, the US Congress set up a House Select Committee on Assassinations, which concluded in '79 that there probably had been a conspiracy to murder Kennedy. But which conspiracy? By now, there was a bewildering number of theories to choose from. Some pointed to Castro's Cuba taking revenge for the Bay of Pigs in '61. Some to anti-Castro exiles, angry with Kennedy for going soft on Cuba. Others to the CIA or J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. Others still to the mafia or rogue elements in the military. With the 80s came more theories, taking the idea of a conspiracy even nearer to government itself.
There's actually 2 conspiracies here. We have the conspiracy to kill the president. Now, who was behind that, who was involved, that's still very big questions. But then we have the conspiracy to cover up the truth of what happened, and that one is very demonstrable, and that can be laid right at the feet of federal officials of the United States government, which of course elevates this crime to the level of a coup d'etat.
It was Jim Mars's book, together with that of Garrison's, that became the basis for Oliver Stone's film JFK. Is a conspiracy thriller about one man's search for the truth behind the assassination.
And who killed the president?
Kevin Costner plays Jim Garrison, the New Orleans DA, but also, according to Stone, a composite figure who guides us through the maze of conspiracy research, starting with undermining the lone gunman theory. Through Garrison, we enter the dark world of conspiracy theory. Stone's film is an all-out attack on the Warren Report. Instead of Oswald, Stone points the finger at far bigger suspects. He shifts the focus from Dallas to Washington. Claims like these have caused huge controversy in the States.
If he hadn't said to begin with was nonfiction, I wouldn't care what he does. But this is irresponsible. This deceives and misleads the people. It's the Warren Report from the other side.
Everything in the movie is either fact or very informed conjecture. And there is a basis for everything that is stated in the film.
No, he didn't get the history right. That's what concerns me about that film, because he really has put out a film which is massive disinformation.
My movie speaks an inner truth about an event that happened in our history that's very dark, very sinister.
The furore started when the film was still in the script stage, with attacks in Time and the Washington Post. The Post began with a 3,500-word onslaught by George Lardner, who writes on national security. But that was just the beginning. When the film opened in December, other big guns began firing. The New York Times.
These allegations are only unproved speculations, and the evidence presented is often a stacked deck.
The Wall Street Journal.
What sells, it seems, is precisely the hatred for the U.S. and its institutions that saturates JFK.
And the Washington Post again, with a piece by former member of the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford.
False charges of this kind are a desecration to the memory of President Kennedy and a fraudulent misrepresentation of the truth to the American public.
The political and media establishment were fighting back. The main charges against Stone were getting the history wrong, misleading audiences by mixing up archive film and dramatic reconstruction, and by focusing on Jim Garrison, giving credibility to the wildest kinds of conspiracy theory. Stone has been attacked from the left, too, for over-idealizing Kennedy, and in particular his Vietnam policy. The portrayal of Kennedy as the man who would have pulled America out of Vietnam is a crucial part of Stone's thesis. But JFK and the debate it has provoked are not just about history. For Stone, Kennedy's death clearly represents an American loss of innocence, and the film is about myth and the special place Kennedy holds in the American imagination.
Stone has entered the echoing halls of the largest paranoid myth of our time, the undeclared national belief that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was killed by the concentrated forces of malign power in the land. It is not only our unspoken myth, but our national obsession.
Well, with me in the studio now are the American journalist James Walcott, Anthony Summers, who has spent many years researching Kennedy conspiracy theories, the writer and American political observer Christopher Hitchens, the author D.M. Thomas, whose latest novel, Falling into Love, explores the power of the Kennedy myth, and Pierre Salinger, who was press secretary to John F. Kennedy during his years as president. Gentlemen, welcome. If indeed this Big Daddy theory is right, then we have a extraordinary film on our hands. Christopher Hitchens, did you believe any of it?
Not a word. It's a tissue of nonsense from beginning to end. Its originating nonsense is the idea of Kennedy as the Sir Galahad that we all miss. Not true. It opens with Eisenhower saying America should beware of the military-industrial complex. It fails to say that Kennedy ran against Eisenhower and Nixon from the right, accusing them of selling the country to the Russians, accusing them of giving Cuba away, inventing a missile gap that wasn't there, and moving into Vietnam. In other words, and then in this very narcissistic manner that's very popular in America at the moment, saying the country lost its innocence by losing this man. Now, in my submission, a country that had been through Hiroshima and McCarthyism hadn't any innocence to lose. And it's pure therapy to believe that that was so, and it's the sort of therapy that Stone is going for. Then he misses every chance there could possibly be to get at the truth. Why would a filmmaker give up a president who we know was sleeping with the mistress of the leader of organized crime, Sam Giancana? A filmmaker gives this up? Here is a woman who was running errands for organized crime for a president whose father was mobbed up, his terrible father, the man who made him president, the man who the British government had to retire as ambassador because he was pro-Nazi, the man who made his fortune in prohibition, mobbed up from start to finish. They miss this too. Stone doesn't know a good movie when he sees one. If he only told what we definitely know, what it doesn't take a conspiracy theorist, or even someone like myself,
who is
a theorist of conspiracy.
Are you saying if it only took what we know, we would still get to the Warren report, or we would get to another conspiracy?
If you took what we all know, which is much more exciting than this paranoid fiction, and much more radical, and much more revolutionary, and much more challenging to the establishment, of course the Warren Commission simply acts, as usual, as a tranquilizer. It says none of this must be known. The connection between, for example, Kennedy and the Mafia was never to be investigated.
All right, so
the names of the gangsters don't even appear in the Warren
There were other
Commission.
dirty linen, but he pulled out the wrong dirty linen.
Well, the Warren Commission doesn't even discuss this option.
All right, Pierre Salinger.
Well, let me start by saying that in the introduction you said some things that are true. I think one of the most important things that people should remember is that when the Warren Commission report came out, about 80% of the American people believed it. We were not at that point in a conspiracy mindset. All of that has been changed by history. We've gone through Watergate, we've gone through Iran-gate, people don't trust the government anymore, people look at conspiracy, and it has moved towards the idea of conspiracy.
So you're saying we were, in a sense, in a state of innocence? America was in a state of innocence?
Well, I mean, there's been so much, there's one point in the JFK film which I think tells everything, and that is, after Kennedy's assassinated, one of the actors, I don't know what role he's playing, says, we have eliminated Camelot. Interesting. The word Camelot never appeared about the Kennedy administration until 10 days after he was dead. Well, therefore, people are now going into what the media have done over a period of 28 years to create what they call a myth about John Kennedy.
But Stone's film is partly an exploration of the myth as well as the reality.
Well, the myth doesn't exist. Let's talk about two different things. One, Kennedy as president, we haven't got time to analyze that, but that's not a myth. It's either looking at the things he made when he made mistakes, looking at the serious things he did that were very great victories for the United States and the world. Myth is something that developed after he was assassinated.
So are you saying that Stone's film is myth, that not a word of it is true?
Oh, Stone's film is just rubbish. I mean, to charge that Kennedy was assassinated by a high-level plot of people in the United States is just not true. And it's based on information which is provably untrue. The fact that people were mad at him because of what he was doing about Vietnam or the Cuban Missile Crisis, all that is untrue.
All right, so the why both you and Christopher Hitchens seem agreeing on is not true.
Well, important distinction, just a second. There's a false antithesis in America which shouldn't take root in England while there's a chance to stop it. You don't have the choice between Stone and the Warren Commission. It is quite possible to believe that the Warren Commission was merely a cover-up to tranquilize the public, not to allow anyone to know anything of what had been going on under the Kennedy administration or among its foes.
All right, okay.
And not to believe the idealized version of Kennedy, the Shakespearean Hamlet with a touch of Freud nonsense that he's confected.
Yes, there are a lot of Shakespearean comments.
You know, the Warren Commission is undoubtedly a cover.
That was not something that was, yeah, but that was not, I can't tolerate that, because that's not something that was put out by the Kennedy administration to try to hide facts. The Kennedy administration should be evaluated on the basis of what he did as president. Well, and not with all its, I mean, we're not going to get into discussions about women.
Well, let's move back onto
totally ridiculous.
Can I stop you both? Let's move back onto the figure of Kennedy later, because we certainly will come to that again. Anthony Summers, you've done a lot of work into so-called conspiracy theories. Has Stone got anywhere near what you got near, or is he way off track?
I was surprised to find that when I saw the movie, which I believe Mr. Salinger hasn't, and I think that's important. I think to comment to the movie, one has to have seen it. And I was surprised to find, having gone in, knowing the number of things that he distorted, and he does distort things, the whole thesis that in some way the president was killed in order to make sure that America went into Vietnam is based on nothing at all. I know his Mr. X in the movie. I know who he is. He's called Fletcher Prouty. He's an extremely dubious witness. And there's nothing to that. But it has to be said, and it's the only thing I can speak to from my years of research and talking to witnesses, that the facts that he gets over about what happened in Dealey Plaza, about the witnesses, about the intrinsic mysteries to the things that the Warren Commission never resolved and in many cases swept completely under the carpet, those things stand up very well in the movie and are done fairly faithfully. And there's one extra thing to say, that we don't have to choose, as Christopher Hitchens was saying, between the Warren Commission and the Stone movie. there was a tremendously expensive congressional investigation in the late 70s, which was in fact what moved me to write my book. They spent $6 million, and they concluded, as you said in your introduction, that there was probably a conspiracy to murder the president. What you didn't say in the introduction, which I thought you should have said, was that they didn't just say there was a conspiracy and we've no idea who was behind it. They very strongly suggested that two particular mafia leaders, Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, who's still alive, were perhaps behind the assassination. And the chief counsel of the committee has since said in private, to me among others, that he thinks that elements of US intelligence, probably the CIA, were also involved. Now that's important.
All right, so here we have another version of the conspiracy.
It's not a version, that's the congressional investigation.
Well, that is their version of what they think happened or might have happened. James Walcott, did you believe the Warren Commission? Did Stone's film do anything to stop you believing it? Have you always been a skeptic on such matters?
Well, you know, the attacks on the Warren Commission started fairly early. I think by the time the movie came out, no one really believed the Warren Commission. It's a matter of what you do believe. I think one thing you were saying about the movie, which is very true, is that the great value of it cinematically is it does in a sense suggest prismatic forces. In other words, it's not somebody up on the 6th floor by himself. There's a convergence of forces. And
you're saying it wasn't a lone gunman?
Yeah, but also the way that it's shot, I mean, it's as if Stone has antennae for eyes. I mean, the camera's swinging here and there and there, and you get the sense all the time that things are in motion, and that it's all in motion for these terrible 6 seconds. I mean, Don DeLillo said that the 6 seconds of the Zapruder film are the 6 seconds that broke the spine of American history. I mean, that may be a little overdone, but there is a sense that all of this is moving, and then when Stone gets to the Zapruder film towards the end, and it's a totally, outrageous scene, because in fact Garrison didn't make the great summation that we see. But the fact is that when you see the Zapruder film on a big screen, it has a terrible power. And when you hear the words over and over again, back and to the left, back and to the left.
This is the film that the Independent Observer took, which actually shows the process of the
and
shots
which the
hitting
American
the body.
people were not allowed to see, I might say, until the mid-70s. Yeah.
So, are you saying partly, and if you are, I think I would agree with you, that whatever Stone may have got wrong in content, he puts it across very powerfully?
There are moments where the movie sags. When the camera isn't moving and he's giving you a civics lesson, whether it's, towards the end of the movie, you've got Kevin Costner doing, in a sense, To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, he's got his pipe and he's lecturing us about civics.
It is an endless speech.
Yeah.
The good are very good in this film.
It's a terrible... Also, I think the long sequence with the Deep Throat character, Mr. X, goes on and on. That actually is to set up Costner as a Frank Capra character, because we actually see him at the Lincoln Memorial. It's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Well, Stone is a movie maker. He can have his homage.
Well, yeah, but in a movie like this, you don't want somebody playing those kinds of games. I mean, actually, one of the things I give Stone credit for is the fact that there's virtually no sex in the movie, which in a perverse way is a tribute, because what he's saying is, I'm concentrating on what I think is important, and I'm not going to throw in cheap sexual thrills. I mean, somebody else would have done that.
It's another way in which it isn't true to life, because, as I say, that's you can't really make a film about the Kennedys without
this is a film
showing
about
that in every sense
life.
of the word, the president was in bed with organized crime. And the point is this what is known in the trade as a blowback? For example, Ben Bradlee, who was another Kennedy lover and Kennedy pal and Kennedy biographer, editor of the Washington Post, accidental uncoverer of Watergate, said he couldn't believe Judith Exner, the mistress of Sam Shankana, when she said she knew Kennedy that well. And when she printed in her book the private numbers for the White House on relevant weekends. When, he said, he went back in his own diaries and looked at what the numbers were and found that they matched, he said he thought he was going to just...
All right, well, listen, I want to throw this open to D.M. Thomas.
Because it's so important that this absurd idea of the lost prince and the broken succession and the loss of innocence.
I want to put this to D.M. Thomas, because D.M. Thomas has written a novel which, to a certain extent, is on the Stone side. It agrees that there's some kind of conspiracy. But more important than that, shows Kennedy flaws and all. There's a great deal of sex in your novel, but still finds the power of the man. The White Prince idea is not gone from you because he slept with a lot of women. Now explain that.
Well, it would be gone if he hadn't, that's what I'm saying.
I think looking at Kennedy from the point of view of an outsider and a young man when it happened, I didn't think that he was a saint. The revelations of sexual activity did come as something as a surprise. But what moved me about Kennedy and made me weep when he was killed was the fact that he seemed to be standing up for a world of diversity, a world of searching for peace. It appears that he was kind of neurotic about death. There's a lovely story about one of his children bringing a dead bird into the White House, and he says, take that out of here, take that out of here. He didn't like death. Now, I like a president who didn't like death, and through his test ban treaty, he probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the future, according to Sakharov, the Russian nuclear physicist. Okay, he didn't like death, he liked sleeping with women. It seems to me that today we would prefer him if he had hated sleeping with women, but rather like death and killed off a few thousand in Vietnam. So I go for
the famous Shirley MacLaine saying, it's better to do it to a woman than do it to the country.
That's right. So I'm interested in his complexity, his good and bad, and that's partly what I try to get across in my book.
You would like to see the real Kennedy emerge rather than the myth. Who is the real Kennedy? Was there the White Prince there, or do you not want that myth?
I was with him, I lived with him, I worked with him, I admired him, I trusted him, I never considered him a prince. And that's one of the things that bothers me is about since his death is this whole kind of idea that he was a prince. He was a politician. He was elected to the job. He, as I said earlier in this broadcast, made some mistakes. The biggest one of all was the Bay of Pigs, to have accepted a covert operation handed over to him by a previous administration and having done it. But he also did some very dramatic things. He saved the world from nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. He's the one that launched America into space. When he launched the space program, he said, we're going to have somebody on the moon by the end of this decade. There was somebody on the moon by the end of the decade. He moved in education. He moved in the problems of racial problems in the United States. And as the time went on, he was elected by a very narrow margin. He did not have any real basic public support when he was elected. By the time he was assassinated, he was a highly popular American president, not only in America, but around the world.
Chris Hitchens, I want to bring you on this because I know you'll disagree with that version of Kennedy, but would you agree that a great many American people, along with Stone, would like to see that version, and why?
Well, like everyone else of my generation, I can remember exactly where I was standing on the fateful day when John Fitzgerald Kennedy nearly killed me, because I can remember the Cuba crisis, and I can remember him so far from hating nuclear war and nuclear weapons, being prepared to risk a nuclear war for a quarrel with Cuba that he was conducting by means of a hit team, originally, or employing the mafia to try and kill Castro. I don't think there's a dissociation between Eros and Thanatos of the kind that Mr. Thomas thinks. I think there's a very close connection. I think Kennedy's easy resort to violence and force, to the murder of Cubans, to the murder of Vietnamese, to the employment of dirty, deniable people, even to kill his allies, like the Ziem family in Vietnam, the right-wing Catholic family.
He had nothing to do with that.
Oh, come on,
There's no proof of that, whatever.
Look, you were paid to say that at the time. You don't
I'm not
have to
paid
say
to say that. We had a liar put that.
You don't have to say
we had a liar make statements.
Give it a rest.
Who was involved in Watergate.
Everybody knows.
It is now proved that he wrote totally fake documents.
Kennedy's resort to violence was very cheap.
No, I can't stand this kind of discussion.
That's what a blowback means.
All right, listen to Mr. Summers for a second.
That's what a blowback means. He thought he could pick these dirty people up and use them a few times.
I think Christopher is wrong on this. There is no evidence that the Kennedys were involved in the assassination of Jen.
All right, well, let's move away from what Kennedy did or didn't do, and let's talk about what the American people would like to believe. Now, it seems pretty clear, Oliver Stone's film, like it or not, and I believe you haven't even seen it, Mr. Salinger, is
I will never see it. I don't go see rubbish.
Well, it may make it difficult for you to comment on a film that you haven't seen.
But I've read everything that Oliver Stone's written about it, so I know exactly what his mentality is.
But what you don't have there is any
cognitive dissonance.
Excuse me, what you don't have there is any understanding of the impact that it's having on people.
I know the impact. I know the impact exactly.
And something of that impact is that people need to believe that there was a conspiracy. Now, I want to try.
No, it's not a question of should they believe there's a conspiracy. They are going to come out of this film believing this conspiracy. I don't think it's impossible there was a conspiracy. I've never said that. I say this conspiracy is rubbish.
It would be extremely interesting, if I may just interject, and forgive me for asking a question, but it's so useful to have Mr. Salinger here. Can you give us any notion of what Robert Kennedy, for example, died believing about his brother's assassination?
I think that he still believed in the Warren Commission when he died.
Fully? Because Arthur Schlesinger says he thought that by that time that he thought...
Well, there was an evolving thought in the Kennedy family at that time about the possibility of conspiracy, but no proof. Nothing that had come up that was provable to them. That
no, but it's fascinating.
All right,
look,
Christopher,
your question still stands.
Well, I'm going to stop because I'd like somebody else to answer it. You can come in and answer it later. Which is, what is this need to believe in conspiracy? And I would posit, and it's something that D.M. Thomas brings up in his book, that in a sense, if there was not a conspiracy, this was even more an appallingly senseless act to happen, and therefore we somehow need a conspiracy.
I'd like to
make
call you on
sense
that, this idea that the public needs to believe in a conspiracy. I think that this is very much a matter of fiction and non-fiction. One of the main reasons that I wrote my book, which I called Conspiracy, because the Congressional Assassinations Committee decided there had probably been a conspiracy, was that when I went down the road for the BBC to do a documentary, I went and knocked on doors in Dallas and around America, but particularly in Dallas, on the doors of relevant witnesses, saying, you know, I'm very sorry to be here, but I'm sure you talked to the FBI and Life magazine and Time and the Washington Post in 1963 and 1964. And time after time, with really relevant witnesses, I found that no one had crossed that threshold before. And either they'd kick me right out, or they'd say to me, Mr. Summers, come in, where have you been all these years? And I wrote that book effectively out of shame for my colleagues, that there are 100 pages of sources in the back of this book, and hardly any of them refer to work done by mainstream media
well, you have
journalists.
an American colleague sitting at your side. Do you think that the media have failed in not uncovering more sooner?
Well, they probably did. One of the things you have to remember is that the country was in a state of shock, and the focus shifted to what Kennedy meant, and there was tons of books of anecdotage about the presidency, and Americans also had this notion of, you know, moving on. We have to move on. We have to do this. Lyndon Johnson came in, bang, bang, bang. And I mean, there was, and also there was, the problem was a lot of, I can remember the talk shows at the time, and a lot of the people who came on and talk about conspiracies were followed by people who had witnessed flying saucers.
Yeah.
You know, there were things like the Joe Pine Show. So for a long time, the whole notion was discredited. So I think there is something to the fact that establishment newspapers felt like, well, we don't really, it's very shadowy, a lot of people are suspect.
Forgive me if I interrupt there, and not because I disagree with you. I interrupt because it has to be said that the reason that kooks and funny buffs investigated the Kennedy assassination, and I've met for my sins most of them, the reason that happened is because there were not mainstream editors on CBS, NBC, New York Times who said to, hold on, let me finish, who said to their Woodwards and Bernsteins of that era, go down the road, wear out your shoe leather, and don't come back here until it's over. That was never done. All they reported, as you rightly say, was the panoply of the thing, and it ended up as chat show, Burt Lancaster films called Executive Action or Winter Kills, fiction. Nobody did the non-fiction job.
I think that's an essential point, because a great establishment tranquilizing term now that's used to sort of put the closure on discussion when skullduggery comes up is, oh, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Everyone hears it. Everyone's learned how to say it. It takes 2 seconds to say. That's the end of the discussion. Conspiracy theorists are a sort of Democrat. They're the volunteers who kick in when the official story just can't be believed. And it's very much to the credit of people like Tony Summers, they're prepared to spend time winnowing wheat from chaff. But it's not to be despised. When you know that the official story is false, as the Warren Commission is, and as Warren admitted in private, he'd been asked to keep public opinion reassured, it's up to those who think that democracy still counts to say, all right, we will think anything is possible. And you have to assume everything's possible.
Well,
that's why Norman Mailer's book is a great deal better than Oliver Stone's film.
Christopher, that if the journalists, in a sense, failed and it became fair game for everyone, then it's fair game for Oliver Stone to impose his own kind of fiction.
No, because
can I finish? Yeah. Can I finish, Anthony? Because in the end, if the journalists don't do it, maybe the artists, like it or not that word, have to take over. Now, somebody like D.M. Thomas also steps in with a book about the myth of Kennedy. And since we've got so far from the facts that all we have now is the myth.
Well, I think the fact that people here disagree so violently about Kennedy shows that somehow that terrible event, and also the complexity of Kennedy and the tension of the time, very close to real war, created a kind of crystallization of history, or a gap in time or something, which made a myth And one of the signs of a myth is that you can see everything both ways. You can see it as good, as bad. You can see Oedipus as hero or culprit, Prometheus as hero or culprit. You can see Kennedy as hero or culprit, and we do. And as a writer, I was interested in exploring the way obsessions take over. But at the heart of my obsession was anger. Even though I'm an Englishman, I'm still angry with America for never fully investigating.
But isn't it, can I just add one thing? But isn't it also that in some respects something like the death of Kennedy makes history and ordinary people come together in a way that very few other acts do? And maybe we need to keep that alive, because that's where ordinary people enter history themselves.
Well, I was, that night when I cried, I don't know where 3 hours went, and I'd give anything to be able to recreate those 3 hours as they actually happened. And I suppose writing a book is my own way of trying imaginatively in vain, to recreate what did really happen. I'd give anything to know that.
I want to come to one final idea, which is why now? It's not simply that Oliver Stone got enough money through all the other films he's made to make this now. I wonder if it's something to do with communism having split apart. What is it that makes this film arrive now? What is there about America?
One thing is of generation has reached a certain point, and a lot of Americans see the Kennedy assassination as the moment American history went off the rails. That it was not just the Kennedy assassination, it was Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King, Vietnam, how did we get into Vietnam, Watergate, and in a sense, what a lot of people want to do, not just Oliver Stone, is create a grand theorem that will cover everything and say these weren't separate acts, they all form a whole, and if we somehow we wrap our mind around it, we'll find it. I'm not sure we will. I think a lot of it is flukes. I mean, I think unfortunately, Sirhan, I don't think fits any of it, but I think that's part of it. A lot of people who came of the baby boom generation, they're now at a point where they're saying, all right, what did it all mean? Because we are, in a sense, now we've passed a lot of it. The Cold War is over. So
but remember,
also there's the question of what happened. This does matter. If a little old lady is killed in Shepherd's Bush tonight, and in 20 years' time somebody finds some evidence that suggests that something else happened, then the case is reopened and reinvestigated. And this happens with little old ladies who get killed. It should happen with the President of the United States. The chief counsel of the Assassinations Committee, who is not a Jim Garrison clown, but a learned professor of law, said in 1978, after his investigation, that he believed there was still evidence to bring people to court and maybe have convictions on this case. And it seems to me that that is where it failed. The Reagan Department of Justice failed. The facts have not been investigated.
Very quick metaphor,
A year ago, another tranquilizing president announced that by blasting Iraq, the Vietnam syndrome was laid to rest. Oliver Stone is here to tell him that's never going to happen. That syndrome's never going to go.
Do you think that we will know the truth in our time, or is it now under so many layers of fact, disinformation, myth, Oliver Stone films, whatever, that we'll never
Well, I think that is a major problem. I agree with you on that. I do agree with also the idea that, I mean, the House committee, which did this investigation back in the 1970s, and they've got 850 boxes worth of testimony, they should let it out and let people look at it and see if there's anything in there which will lead us down the path. I always have wanted to know who killed John Kennedy.
All right.
But I don't like some of these theories because they are not provable.
You haven't seen the film, but that in essence is where you and Kevin Costner and Oliver Stone would agree. Get the information out and then we can all make the decisions based on it.
I agree with them on that.
Gentlemen,
Kennedy Family Archives too.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Tomorrow night on The Late Show, an exclusive performance and interview with Lou Reed and Ian Hislop on desert island politics. But to end, we go back to that November in 1963. This was how BBC's satirical show That Was the Week That Was marked the death of John F. Kennedy, with a decidedly unsatirical song from Millicent Martin and a prescient afterword from a young David Frost. Good night.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun, and no one guessed that a man so blessed would perish by the gun. Lord, would perish by the gun. The shot rang out like a sudden shout, and heaven held its breath, for the dreams of a multitude of men rode with him to his death. Lord rode with him to his death. Yes, the heart